Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you for watching this. This is another of our monthly webinar series called, I actually am not totally sure what the formal name is, but it's sponsored by the KdVS Foundation, and is basically just an opportunity for myself to engage with the clinical and basic research KdVS community about really exciting opportunities that we have as a patient and caregiver and family community to really promote research opportunities for Koolen-de syndrome. So, Lacey, I know you're getting ready, but let me do my little introduction to you both. So Mirko, you have your name. Okay, so today we are going to have a presentation by two terrific scientists out of Stanford University. Mirko Ulrevich. I knew I was not going to do very good. Okay.
Very close.
Mirko is a clinical assistant professor in both departments of psychiatry and behavioral sciences.
Yes.
Okay. Fantastic. And Dr. Lacey Chetcuti, Lacey, you're currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychiatry. Fantastic. So they both have a really cool study right now that I asked them to speak to you all about that's really starting to look at the impact of autism and maybe some other psychiatric symptoms that are relevant or present in disorders like Koolen-de syndrome, and how that impacts their sort of ability to socialize and be social amongst, their peer group and family and other community members. And I thought, as I was thinking about this last night, I thought this was particularly relevant because many caregivers just recently reported that, one of the main priorities for things that they could improve in their children was sort of their communication skills and their ability to interact with their peers. And so I thought, man, that your work really fits fantastically into that and is an opportunity for people, I believe, worldwide to really participate in your study. So without further ado, I think Lacey and Mirko, I will turn it over to you. Usually what we do is you guys present, and then afterwards we either have people who submit questions, or I usually end up asking a lot of questions. And then if we end early, we end early, and that's not really a huge deal. But can you check, Lacey, and make sure, I'm not sure who's starting, but can you see if you're able to share your screen?
It doesn't look like I'm able to. It says host is disabled, the screen share.
Okay, let me see here. Hide none. Okay, now try.
Okay, that looks great. Let me just get that up. Okay.
Perfect. Beautiful.
Great. Okay, excellent. Okay, so thank you very much, Anna, for that introduction. So my name is Lacey Chetcuti, and I'm joined by my colleague Mirko Ulrevich. And as Anna said, we're here to talk to you today about a research study that we're currently doing where we're looking to develop our new questionnaire measure designed to measure social functioning in children with a range of clinical conditions, including genetic syndromes such as Koolen-de. So our presentation today is going to cover a bit of background to this project, and then I'll turn over to Mirko, who will give you a bit of background to the measure and the development of the first edition and what we found. And then I'll finish us off by telling you a bit about the study we're currently conducting and what would be involved, and extend an invitation for you all to participate. So starting off with a bit of background. So we know that interactions with other people are an integral part to our daily lives from the moment that we're born. So the vast array of human behavior that we have evolves out of social interactions. And neuroscience research also tells us that these social encounters from as early as the first few months of life can also have a lasting impact on the brain's structural and functional maturation. So beyond these effects of social encounters on development, the breadth and quality of social interactions is also an important predictor of multiple indicators of psychological well-being and overall life satisfaction. Conversely, a limited breadth and range of social interactions has been linked to delays in acquiring crucial developmental milestones such as motor skills and also language, as well as poorer psychological well-being, so quality of life. And it's also been suggested that a limited range or quality of social interactions could be indicated as a risk factor in the development of several different forms of psychiatric conditions. But we know that social interactions can also be challenging and don't always happen smoothly because they do depend on various individual skills and attributes. So a successful social interaction does require that two or more people are able to communicate with each other using verbal strategies, including spoken language, but also other verbal means such as laughing to indicate when something is humorous or crying to indicate when we're experiencing upset. And also non-verbal strategies as well. So head shaking and nodding and clapping, for example, and also facial expressions so we can indicate what we're feeling. And in addition to being able to produce these different strategies, we also need to be able to interpret other people's verbal and non-verbal communication strategies and make sure that we are on the same page with our communication. We also need to be able to make judgments about what other people are thinking and what other people are feeling, and also their intentions when we're interacting with them. So in other words, being able to mind read or put yourself in another person's shoes. And then finally, not a skill per se, but more so an attribute, the range and frequency of social interactions also does really depend on our internal drive or how motivated we are to seek out those opportunities for social connection, and also how much effort we're willing to put in to maintain social relationships with other people. So some people might have more of a preference for aloneness or more of an introverted type disposition, whereas other people might have more of a preference to be around people more frequently and have more of an extroverted disposition. So we know when there are fewer difficulties in these skills, or when individuals have certain attributes, that social functioning and social interactions and relationships are typically more enhanced. So we know that people with various clinical conditions, including neurodevelopmental conditions like autism spectrum disorder, neuropsychiatric conditions such as anxiety and depression, and also a range of genetic conditions, do experience some challenges across these different social functioning skills and attributes, and that those challenges can sometimes make it difficult to navigate social situations in daily life. So these social functioning challenges do also form part of the diagnostic criteria for some of these conditions, suggesting that they are really a core syndromic feature of these disorders. So we do also know that these social functioning difficulties experienced by people with clinical conditions do emerge quite early in life and do also persist into adulthood, and can lead to a range of outcomes, including developmental, relationship and mental health challenges, and also lower quality of life. So therefore, it's really important that clinicians and therapists can recognise when someone is struggling with social functioning, so they can give them the right help and support, and also, in the case of some syndromes, be able to make a confident clinical diagnosis. However, we do also know that determining a person's social functioning capacity is not a straightforward task for a number of reasons. So as we know, people do vary in many ways, and the social functioning skills and attributes that contribute to our overall social well-being aren't simply present or absent. So you don't either have them or you don't. There's a lot of variation in the expression of these skills and attributes. So in other words, these skills do exist along a functional continuum that ranges from being low or very absent to average range skills, which is what we see the majority of the neurotypical population expressing, to sometimes even very high skills. So this is the case if we consider, for example, the drive or motivation to engage with other people. Whereas in some conditions such as autism spectrum disorder, we see that people often have quite low drive to engage with other people. However, in some conditions, we do also see a higher than average drive to engage with other people. So actually higher than we would see in the neurotypical population. So in addition to this gradation of variability, we also know that social functioning skills aren't uniform. So some aspects of social functioning might be more challenging for others. So for example, a given child might have very low ability to communicate using their verbal means compared to average nonverbal capacities. So they might be more able to communicate using nonverbal means than verbal means. This might be coupled with slightly below average ability to read other people's minds or put themselves in other people's shoes. However, they might have very high drive to engage with other people despite these difficulties. So it's very important that clinicians are using measures that are really able to capture this degree of nuance and able to give us a really nice picture of people's individual profiles of strengths and weaknesses across the skills that contribute to social functioning. So there are various ways that social functioning can be measured. So it can be measured at the level of the behaviour that we observe or see, and it can also be measured in terms of biology or activity in the brain. So currently questionnaires are the most common way that we assess social functioning in research and clinical settings. And that is because they do offer advantages over other methods. So for example, they do take less time for the person implementing them to gather the information. And they also do generally take less time for the person giving the information to do that as well. They also come at a lower cost than other methods, particularly methods like imaging and also methods that involve behavioural observation as well. And they're also able to cover more contexts and behaviours than would be possible, for example, if we were to simply observe a child in one isolated setting for a specified period of time. And therefore, they also draw on the person's extensive experience and also their expertise on their or their child's behaviour. And therefore, we're able to get a really nice depiction of social functioning that is that's quite accurately aligns with real life and what we'd see in real life. However, unfortunately, the questionnaires that we currently are using do have some limitations that do make them less effective for researchers and clinicians. So current questionnaires do tend to cover some functioning skills and attributes, but not others. So this means that a given questionnaire is only really giving us a partial picture of a child's strengths and weaknesses. Or alternatively, it means that we're having to use multiple questionnaires in order to get a comprehensive picture, which really does create burden for the people who are filling them out. The existing questionnaires can also sometimes be difficult to interpret. So, for example, they do often provide us with a score, but don't necessarily tell us what that score means. So, for example, we are often unable to determine where a given child, based on their age, based on their sex, and also based on their developmental ability, is sitting relative to a child with similar attributes, whether they are average or below average or above average. And this information is very important if we're to allocate the right clinical supports and really make sure that we're having a really individually tailored and personalised approach to clinical support. Another difficulty with interpretation is that we also don't know currently, based on the existing questionnaires, what we would expect to be a typical or normal level of progress. So it's often the case in clinical practice that we would administer a questionnaire at the beginning of treatment to get a baseline level, and then we'd administer the same questionnaire at the end of treatment to see how far we've come along in our skills. However, currently, the current questionnaires, we don't really know how much progress would be considered, normal for a child with a given age, sex, or developmental ability. And then finally, the existing questionnaires really only cover a portion of that functional continuum that I showed in the previous slide. So, for example, many questionnaires have been developed for children who have neurotypical development and therefore are only really good at capturing this sort of middle portion of that functional continuum and don't really give us a good picture of children who have very low skills and attributes, or even children who have higher skills and attributes than average. Conversely, questionnaires have been developed for children who have clinical conditions. However, these do really only cover that lower end of the functional continuum, so really are mostly focused on capturing deficits in social functioning skills and attributes, and therefore aren't able to capture that high end of that continuum. So thinking back to social drive or social motivation, we're not really capturing whether children are expressing this attribute at very higher than average levels. And actually, none of the current available questionnaires are able to capture that high level of social motivation in particular. So given these limitations, there is a need for us to develop new measures of social functioning that can be used in research and also clinical practice that are capable of covering the full range of skills and attributes that are crucial for social interactions and social functioning. Measures that also provide scores that can be readily interpretable by the people administering them and also are as most useful as they can be in clinical settings. And importantly, questionnaires need to be applicable across a broad range of neurodevelopmental, neuropsychiatric, and genetic conditions, as well as the general neurotypical population. So our research team has been working towards this aim since 2013, so a little over a decade now, with the development of the Stanford Social Dimension Scale. This scale, we are currently evaluating the second edition of the scale, but I'm going to turn over to Mirko now, who's going to tell you a little bit about the development and findings for the first version.
Thank you, Lacey, and thank you again, Anna, for opportunity to present. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk about the work we do, and hopefully, people in attendance will find some of it relevant and interesting. So as Lacey mentioned, what's really crucial in terms of research and also clinical work is to be able to capture the building blocks of social functioning in a precise and effective and systematic way. Thus, we have developed, as Lacey mentioned, the original version of the Stanford Social Dimension Scale, or SSDS, to be able to really capture some of the key or essential abilities that underpin one's ability to navigate the complexities of the social world. The SSDS was developed following the gold standard practices that were put forward by the National Institute of Health PROMIS framework. So this framework is very detailed and describes a number of different and essential steps that should be followed when one is developing any clinical or research measure. So these steps include, firstly, conducting a systematic review in order to canvass the literature and to identify all the skills, abilities, and traits that need to be captured. And also to identify all the existing measures in order to understand the advantages and limitations of existing instruments that the measure that is being developed needs to address. Following this, once we identify the behaviors that have to be captured, and then once we identify the areas of need in terms of assessments, The next step is to create what we call an item bank. So a number of questions that parents and families can answer in order for clinicians and researchers to be able to gain insights into their child's social functioning profile. So we've done all this work, as Lacey mentioned, quite a while ago, starting in 2013. So once we generated the item bank, we engaged with and sought feedback from experts, so both clinicians and researchers who have done work across neurodevelopmental and neurogenetic conditions, as well as experts in social functioning. And then we also engaged with parents and families of kids who have autism, but also a range of other neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric conditions in order to seek the feedback on the initial items that we have developed. Based on the feedback, we refined some of the items. And as you can see on the screen, we landed on 58 items. And each item or each question is rated on a scale from 1, so whether the person exhibits this behavior, so 1 indicates never, to 5, which indicates always. It's also important to note that what we really wanted to achieve is to develop questions that are as much as possible independent of language abilities of a particular person, so that our measure can be applicable and can be used firstly across the lifespan, because we know that a number of these conditions persist across the lifespan. So by definition, the measure should be applicable. And importantly, that the measure can be used independently of whether the person has intellectual disability or it doesn't, which, as Lacey has pointed out, is a limitation of some of the previous instruments, because some of them have been developed for the non-clinical populations, in which case a range of items are just not applicable to kids and adolescents and adults who have neurodevelopmental conditions, especially when they're associated with intellectual disability. Or, on the other hand, if they're developed for groups that are clinical and have intellectual disability, they're not as sensitive in terms of capturing higher aspects of abilities. And we know that kids differ a lot depending on their conditions. It's really important to be able to sensitively capture those differences. Following this, we have collected the data on those 58 items in 2 independent studies. So firstly, for children and adolescents with autism, and then from a large sample of children with neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric conditions. And once we got the data, we used a range of psychometric statistical procedures to first evaluate whether the original SSDS was effective in capturing key skills that it was meant to capture, and then whether it was done, whether this was done in a reliable and valid way. Maybe in the next slide, Lacey. Thank you. So here on this slide, you can see 4 social functioning attributes that SSDS was developed to capture, and that our analysis demonstrated that the SSDS was indeed able to capture well in sufficient detail and with a sufficient validity and reliability. So Lacey has mentioned these aspects or building blocks of social functioning, but I'll kind of just go through them like quickly now, and then you can also see, hopefully, for each of these attributes, we have an example item, so you can see what the questions look like a little bit. So the first domain is what we call social motivation. So social motivation and social affiliation are aspects of what we call social drive. So one's desire or inclination to social engage. So social motivation is a drive and or interest to interact social with others, independent of the quality of interaction or overtures. So in other words, even if the child is nonverbal and it might have difficulties in communicating, what we're capturing here is whether they are motivated to social engage, regardless of their ability to actually maintain social interaction. And social affiliation are really what we call affiliative behaviors that are related to or a consequence of social motivation. So for example, as you can see, like in this item, when a child is enjoying something, do they try to share that enjoyment with their parent or with the other people? So they're motivated, and it's a specific behavior that's meant to maintain some of these social connections or to effectively implement social motivation into engagement with others. Then we had the third one is social communication. So a range of behaviors that are necessary for initiating, maintaining, and ending social interaction. So a range of verbal and nonverbal gestures and behaviors that people use in their everyday lives, like to social interact with others. And finally, social recognition, or the ability to perceive and interpret social signals that are related to both emotions and mental states. So how well the child is able to, in other words, read people's minds, so to speak. So whether they're able to put themselves in other person's shoes, whether they're able to recognize facial expressions, whether they're able to understand other people's body language, and whether they're able to modulate their behavior accordingly. So, for example, if someone is looking bored, whether they would modify the way they interact. So on that note, I'll ask for a next slide. So with every measure that's developed, so it's always really important to firstly evaluate what I just mentioned, whether they're actually able to capture the constructs or abilities that they're meant to capture. But then the second equally important step is to look at how useful a measure is for research and clinical application. And there's various ways to do this. So we applied kind of quite a comprehensive way of testing this. So we've done this by conducting 3 different types of analysis to look at the validity and usefulness. So firstly, what we've done is that we examined whether SSDS was able to effectively distinguish differences or capture differences in social functioning among children with different clinical conditions. And as you can see on the slide, this was indeed the case, as kids with autism exhibited the greatest challenges across all the abilities captured by the SSDS. And this was followed by kids with other neurodevelopmental conditions, with kids with obviously kids who are neurotypical displaying the fewest difficulties, but obviously there's a wide range of individual differences. So some kids, even though they don't have diagnosis, they might have some aspects of the social functioning that are lower compared to other kids. Secondly, what is also really important is to examine whether the difficulties in social functioning, as measured by the SSDS in this case, are associated with strengths and weaknesses in other clinical outcome domains. In other words, what's really important, for example, when doing clinical assessments, is to understand whether child's areas of need, for example, in social motivation, might predict other aspects of their clinical and cognitive functioning. So what we found is that kids with lower social drive, so lower social motivation, and with more limited social communication abilities tended to express more what we call emotional problems or difficulties with anxiety and depression and symptoms along that spectrum. And that kids with limited social communication abilities were more likely to exhibit dysregulation and a range of behavioral problems. So on the next slide, which was a final test or a final thing that we looked at with SSDS. So with every measure, really one of the ultimate goal is to assist researchers and clinicians to understand each person's profile of strengths and areas of challenges, whether the support might be needed. So what we've done is we used what we call a subtyping approach or analysis to examine whether the SSDS was able to identify subgroups of kids and adolescents with unique social functioning profiles. So it's a bit of a busy figure, so hopefully you can see it okay, but I'll try to kind of like guide you through it a little bit. So what we were able to identify is 4 subgroups or that are named as clusters here. So like a cluster means like a group of kids based on their social motivation, social affiliation, social recognition, and social communication abilities as captured by the SSDS. And also just to orient you, the higher scores on SSDS mean higher level of abilities. So the SSDS captures one's ability. So if the score is higher, means that kids are like better, like in this, or like have less challenges in this particular area. If the scores are lower, that means that they have more challenges and then more support is needed. So as you can see again, like 4 subgroups here. So subgroups 1 and 4 were distinguished by what we call a severity gradient. So in other words, if you look at the figure, group 1 had the lowest SSDS scores across all 4 subscales, indicating that this group had the most challenges. And would need, clinically speaking, this group would probably need support across all these 4 different areas of social functioning, while relatively speaking, the group 4 had the highest scores or the least challenges. So this is what we call a severity gradient. But what's particularly interesting, and what we've done analysis with quite a few measures thus far, and something that doesn't usually happen or is difficult to capture is what we call qualitative differences in terms of the profiles. And this is what we were able to capture with subgroups 2 and 3. So more specifically, group 2 had relative strengths in terms of social motivation and social recognition. So as you can see, that they're not that different than the group 4 that had the least challenges. However, this group showed relative challenges in social communication, where it was almost as low as the first group. Conversely, group 3 had relative challenges in social recognition, but relative strengths in social communication. So we were able to identify these 2 groups that had relatively distinct social profiles and might need support in different areas. So why, for example, subgroup 1 might not need support in social motivation, they would need support in some other areas, which is very important clinically and also in terms of research, because then we can explore this further and see what are the actual underpinning additional differences between these groups. And what is also important to mention is that we show that they're actually predictive of emotional and behavioral problems. And the final slide for the first version, before Lacey starts kind of expanding on how on our current thinking where we should go with these measures, is although we were able to demonstrate the original version of SSDS was really enhanced the existing measurement landscape by isolating specific skills that vary, as you've seen, within and across different clinical conditions, and associated uniquely with clinical outcomes. There were several areas where this measure could really be enhanced. For example, offering distinct evaluation of verbal and nonverbal communication skills, which is something that was to some degree missing from the original one, incorporating assessments of comprehension along communication production. And also it was important to enhance representation of individuals at highest end of the functional continuum, and particularly important in this context. What we really wanted to make sure is that the new scale was relevant and effective for kids and adolescents and individuals in general across the lifespan with genetic conditions. So Lacey will talk a little bit about our new and hopefully improved version of the SSDS.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study we're currently conducting to test our new and improved version of the SSDS. So this version incorporates the questions that were on the original scale of the SSDS, but we have added a host of additional questions to ensure that we're assessing all of those skills and attributes that contribute to social functioning and making sure that we're capturing that full functional continuum from low to very high functioning. So this second edition of the SSDS is really aiming to fill those gaps that Mirko talked about on that previous slide. So we have again followed those best practice guidelines put forth by the National Institute of Health to develop the SSDS2, including receiving input from 50 experts and clinicians on social functioning, and also from 25 parents of children with various clinical conditions to make sure that our items are as clear and refined as possible. And I have included a URL at the bottom of the page here. We would love to have you participate in our study to help us develop the SSDS. There's also a QR code there too that you can use to navigate to the study. It is also accessible on the computer as well as on your phone as well. So we are currently inviting parents of children who are aged 5 to 17 years to complete our online survey. These parents are parents of children who have neurodevelopmental conditions, neuropsychiatric conditions, as well as genetic conditions. And we're also seeking input from children, of parents of children who have neurotypical development as well. So really wanting to involve parents of children with as many diversities and as many differences as we possibly can. So in our online survey, you'll be asked to complete the SSDS2, as well as a number of other existing questionnaires that regard your child's development, as well as other traits and behaviours that are relevant to social functioning. Our online survey is split into 2 parts. So we have a first part, which contains the very most essential measures that we'd like to collect. That essential part of the survey will take about 30 to 45 minutes to complete. And then we have an additional optional part, which, as the name suggests, is optional to complete, which contains additional questionnaires that would give us added information to help with our study. And that will take an additional 30 to 40 minutes to complete. So all up, the set of questionnaires will take approximately 60 to 85 minutes, depending on whether you do both components or just the essential component. And we'll be doing a raffle at the end of the study. If you do participate in our study, you'll have a 1 in 25 chance of winning a $25 Amazon gift card. If you do complete that optional component, you'll get an additional entry into the raffle, so you'll double your chances of winning. So on that note, we'd again like to thank Anna and Ashley for having us along today to talk about our study. And also thank you for listening to our presentation and extend the invitation to you to participate in our study if it does seem of interest to you. So thank you so much, and really happy to answer questions that you have.
Perfect. Beautiful. That was great, you guys. Thank you. So since we didn't actually figure out how to show it live on Facebook or whatever social media platform, I just get to sort of take over and ask the questions that I wrote down. And so hopefully they will kind of reflect what other people are thinking when they watch this. Okay, so one of the things that I was thinking about, and you just mentioned it right at the end, is the sort of clusters that you guys were showing. Mirko, you're showing like how some kids can be impaired in one sort of social domain and not in others, and that sort of dictates the type of treatments that you would recommend. But I don't really have a good sense of like what those treatments are, right? Like, are they like behavioral interventions? Is there a pill? Like, I just want to get a good sense of, let's say you can come up with an example, but like, how would the treatments be tailored to the different parts of social communication or social function that you're poor in? And then what do those treatments actually look like?
No, that's a really great question. And I would just put a caveat that unfortunately, similar to where we are in terms of assessments, that's kind of where we are with the interventions as well. So a lot of interventions are fairly, firstly, they're mostly behavioral. behaviorally based for any level of social functioning aspects. But they tend to be fairly general. So in other words, they're a collection of a range of techniques that are meant to address various challenges or support kids and families in addressing those challenges, but they're still what we call eclectic. So rather than having packages for addressing social communication or social motivation or difficulties understanding mental states, they're more a selection of techniques. And the way that I guess at this stage our clinical work is oriented is that most of these things are driven by a child-specific diagnosis. But where we do want to be, at least in terms of assessments, is to go beyond that and be able to understand that this particular child might not necessarily need support for social motivation, but they might actually need support for their communication abilities. So I'll give an example. So a range of interventions that are specific to difficulties that are thought to be underpinned by autism as a disorder or condition focus on enhancing child's desire to interact socially. Because we usually think about autism as a prototypically social motivation condition. However, what's important is that like since 60s and work by Lorna Wing in UK, so she has described a group of kids who actually had a fairly high levels of social motivation. I mean, relatively speaking, obviously, there's always individual differences, but because of their high levels of social motivation, but difficulties in ability to communicate and regulate their emotions, those kids might be at actually particularly high risk of developing anxiety, depression, because they want to interact, but they also face challenges. So for those particular kids, with like rather than trying to enhance their social motivation by approaches such as early start Denver model or Jasper or pivotal response treatment, what we would focus there is more on trying to assist developing some of the social communication abilities and also more monitor any potential anxiety or depression developing. So I would say that we're still at very, very unfortunately early stages, but what is good is that this is something that has been identified as an area of need, both in terms of ability to assess, which we're hopefully doing with especially new version of SSDS, but also that then informing the treatment approaches.
So one interesting, that that makes me think of the fact that there's, I think in Koolen-de syndrome specifically, there is between like maybe 10 to 20% of kids are totally nonverbal. So I'm wondering, like, how do you tease apart some of these issues with social functioning with the fact that the kid is like either nonverbal or has very limited verbal skills, and the fact that, it's like some of those, sorry, let me articulate myself. Has there ever been an approach, or do you think it would be a potential treatment strategy is like improving the communication in the kid as opposed to sort of targeting social functioning, because one is probably driving the other? Like how does that piece, and also this is really relevant for the other autistic disorders that you guys are thinking about too, is like how do you decide whether you focus on like improving their desire to socialize with others when you know that they probably don't want to socialize with others because they can't communicate the same way the other kids can? And should you like target helping them increase their verbal skills as opposed to worrying about desire? Does that make sense at all? You know what I'm saying? So how do you think about that? Like what how would you approach? Go ahead.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So thinking about our measure with and I guess as Mirko sort of mentioned before, we really wanted to make sure that our items were able to capture these things without needing language. So if we take like social motivation, for example, language is just one way that we do express our social interest and our social desires. So making sure that we do also capture things like proximity seeking, or how often children are actually sort of moving themselves physically to be within sort of the realm of other people, or how often they're looking towards other people. So not necessarily just using their language. So that is something that we are really trying to capture with the SSDS, is making sure it is independent of language. But that is a really great question about social motivation. And I guess, you know, how do you ensure that a social interaction is actually rewarding, or ensuring that a social interaction is actually happening smoothly when we don't have language to be able to communicate with another person? I'm not sure if, Mirko, you've got any thoughts on sort of that aspect.
Yes, so some of the interventions kind of try to meet the child where they are currently. So even though they might be nonverbal, they're still able to communicate in various other ways. So, for example, one of the ways is nonverbal through showing, or like, for example, guiding a parent to a particular object, or for example, being able to share the objects, being able to engage in a game, and also developing some of the alternative strategies, such as showing particular symbols that might be relevant to like their particular needs and desires. So there's some ways of being able to enhance the communication, even though the child might be completely nonverbal. And then there's obviously distinction between kids who are currently nonverbal but might be able to develop some form of spoken or language communication. And there's also kids who will never be able to do that. So that's also something that's important to consider and get information, like if you're a clinician, to be able to tailor this. I'll just make also one really quick point in terms of the assessment. So as Lacey has emphasized throughout her presentation, there's a vast variety of social, of the abilities that underpin one's ability to socially communicate. So what we really need, what measures really need to capture, is this whole spectrum. So from very, not basic, but very essential nonverbal social behaviors to highly verbal, highly complex abilities. And that goes for communication, that goes to ability to understand other people's minds. So like from like being able to interpret very basic emotions on someone's face, to be able to understand what one is thinking about the other person thinking. So there's like a whole range. So what we are quite excited about is that what we want to develop is what's called computerized adaptive testing version. So we basically want to refine our measure so that parents, based on their first initial responses, do not get questions that are completely irrelevant to them.
Yeah.
So what we want to develop is the measure which is quicker, so parents don't have to address like 700 questions. But also we know for a fact it can be quite frustrating having to answer questions that are not relevant for a particular child. But with the caveat that in order to get there, we actually have to get the data on a full range of items, so that then we can do like a specific analysis which will enable us to develop this version of the scale. So at this point, the survey that Lacey shared the link for and the QR code actually has all the items. So we fully acknowledge that it might be a little bit frustrating answering a lot of questions that might be completely either too easy for the kid and they're like, yeah, of course my child can do this. Like, why am I answering 50 questions about that? Or conversely, my child is nonverbal. Why am I answering this question? Well, the reason is even though we acknowledge it can be a little bit, it's time consuming and can be a little bit frustrating to do that. That will give us information to be able to develop a version where the parent would not have to do this. Totally. So I just want to kind of carry that as well.
No, that's smart. I know that there's a couple other sort of validated assessments, neurodevelopmental assessments, that kind of do that too, is like skipping sections that are not relevant based upon previous answers and ability. So okay, I have two other questions which would be related to neurotypical. So you want people who have neurotypical children to complete the survey as well. So first question is, do you have any idea of the variability even amongst neurotypical children? Like, are there particular domains that they're good or bad at? What's sort of the spread and variability for kids who are neurotypical? And then the second question is, can someone who only has neurotypical children complete this? Like, or does it need to be, for example, Ashley, I don't think you'll care if I say this, like Ashley has a little boy with KdVS, but she also has neurotypical children. Could she fill the survey out once on behalf of her KdVS kid and then fill it out again on behalf of her neurotypical kid between that age range?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So I guess the first part, so we do see that same amount of variability within people who are neurotypical as well. So we do something I do also think is important for us to be able to capture is, we see variability in sort of our usual sort of level of skill, our usual attributes, but those also do fluctuate as the day goes on as well. So we see variability both, I guess, this way and also sort of this way, depending on the time of day, depending on other things like our mood, and also depending on just our general context and where we are at that moment in time. So there is a lot of variability. Sometimes we do see a more even profile of abilities in the neurotypical population than we would in other clinical conditions. So it is common in autism for nonverbal skills to be slightly more developed sometimes than verbal skills. But at the same time, the opposite can be true. Whereas in neurotypical development, we do also see that those, we more often see that those nonverbal and verbal skills are roughly on par with each other. So we do have that variability within there. In terms of, I guess, what's the extent of that variability and can we currently measure it? That's actually a really great question. And I think it's something that, we really don't know at this point. What is that actual extent of that variability? And at what point does that variability tip over to, the level that we'd see in a clinical condition? So we don't quite know then, what is that, what is that cutoff? What is that point where it becomes in that sort of clinical range of either very low or either very high? So yeah, that is something that we actually don't yet know. So
I was thinking that your age range is 5 to 17, is that right? So it's funny because you're capturing the age range that I think of kids as like very social. They want to spend time with their kids and hang out, and they're very active in that. And then the other half is sort of where they're getting into like puberty and other developmental changes where their socialization totally, I'm living this right now with my own family, is changing, right? And they're less those sort of behaviors. So I wonder if you guys are going to get a cohort, like the bottom half ages and the top half ages look totally different in terms of like their
absolutely, and
that's their motivation and stuff like that. I think that will be really interesting to see.
Definitely. No, that's definitely something we're interested in is, how do these skills and attributes express differently at different points in the lifespan, but also how do they change? So how does our level of motivation to engage with others change from when we're children to when we get older? And then beyond that, particularly when you get into adolescence, what are the influences on our social abilities and our social functioning, and how do those influences change in terms of their type, in terms of the extent of their influence? So there's definitely, we are really taking a lifespan perspective with us and a really developmental perspective with our work in that way. So it is something that, we really are hoping to be able to address with the data that we do collect. But
so in terms of the second, sorry to cut you off.
Yes, no, I was just going to say relevant to the second part of your question. So we are also looking for parents of children who are neurotypical. Our definition of neurotypical is also very loose. So we know that no one is actually truly neurotypical, but really just the absence of a clinical diagnosis of a neurodevelopmental, neuropsychiatric or genetic condition. And within the age range is really the only criteria that we're setting. Parents who have multiple children, some who are neurotypical, some with clinical conditions, can complete the survey multiple times. That is fine. So that is also fine.
Okay, let me see. There's a question in the chat before we run out of time. Hold on, let me see if I can figure out. Okay. Blake asked, do you compare and contrast the strengths and weaknesses of the SDSS with other tools like the ADOS, which I don't even know what that is, and then the Vineland?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we are collecting both of those measures in our sample. Well, we're collecting the Vineland in our online survey, and we're hoping to do some subsequent work where we can administer the ADOS, which is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. So we will be looking at how our measure, our SSDS, correlates with these measures, so how much they're agreeing and how much they're measuring the same type of construct. And something we can also look at is how well we're capturing all these different aspects of social functioning using this versus that measure. Okay, add to that.
Yeah, and just to kind of expand this a little bit, these measures were developed with different motivations as well, or for the different rationales. So ADOS was developed specifically to capture the social difficulties that are the most distinguishable, the most distinguish a person with autism as compared to person without autism. So they don't capture the full, they don't canvas the full spectra of abilities. And ADOS actually is not designed to capture abilities, it's designed to capture difficulties. So that's a crucial difference. And then Vineland is developed to capture adaptive functioning. So it captures the various different aspects of adaptive functioning, but was not necessarily developed to capture the different aspects that underpin ability to socially communicate. It captures some, but it doesn't capture comprehensively. So it's kind of, so compared to ADOS, we are capturing abilities or functional aspects, and then compared to one, it provides a bit more comprehensive canvassing. So in many ways, it's complementary to those two measures. So it's just yeah, with a different motivation.
Great. Cool. Well, this has been really fantastic. I think that this is great. This is a really cool opportunity for the KdVS community. So I am going to somehow copy your link and put it sort of in the comments section. I think Ashley posts this on YouTube, their YouTube channel or something like that. So people can actually like copy and paste it into their own browsers and get to use it pretty easily. But thank you guys for your time. Thanks for waking up very, very early on the West Coast to do this. I'm really grateful that you guys were able to do it. And let's hope, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that we get some cool responses.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been really great being able to share with you our study. We're very excited about it.
Yay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.